Hello, comrades. Good afternoon, good evening. Today, on our Storm stream, we're going to cover the interesting topic. To be honest, it's been a hot topic for a long period of time in the international communist movement. And today we're going to see what criticism was put against our point of view on the situation in the modern China, on the essence of the modern Chinese state, on the People's Republic of China. Today we will discuss this thing with Comrade Kevin.
Hello, everyone.
Comrade Tom. Yeah, and me, Comrade Vasily. So we have prepared several excerpts from Midwestern Marx stream, where he's talking about our video on China. Is China socialist? And there are at least several moments where, in our opinion, he makes mistakes. We will show them on the stream and discuss each problem after every fragment we show. And I guess we can start with the first one. Yes, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and you can always ask question following this link. I will put the link in the chat. All right, let's start.
Which is like, I don't get how you can be an ML in the modern day and be against the largest, wealthiest ML state in the world or country in the world, and one of the most powerful and economically stable countries in the world, period, who the UN just recognized their total alleviation of poverty.
All right, so the first argument is that how the one can be a communist and criticize the Marxist-Leninist state. Comrades, do you have anything to tell about it?
Yeah, really, how I would start off is our positions diverge or are different, essentially from what assumptions that we're making. I just think, in general, we don't necessarily accept that China is a Marxist-Leninist state by default, whereas the position taken by Midwestern Marx and his view essentially assumes that China is a Marxist-Leninist state, and then criticizes us by saying, "How could you be against the largest, most prominent Marxist-Leninist state in the world?" And I think the point of disagreement, or the point of where we don't accept his premise, is that it is a Marxist-Leninist state. And I really think that a lot of the other disagreements that we come to are really rooted fundamentally in that premise. And we'll keep circling back to that at various points throughout the stream.
Right. How dare we criticize the largest, most powerful state, the wealthiest state, in the world, basically. One of them.
Tom, do you have anything to say more?
Right. Well, the idea that we should be respecting the wealthiest country in the world, basically just because they have this red flag and because they use this language that we recognize, is funny. The idea that we should side with those who are the most powerful, even when they are doing things that they don't like. And I think what's funny that Eddie Midwest Marx continually says is that he agrees that China is doing capitalist things and doing bad things, and it's always conditional the role of capitalists. He says, "Oh, the state controls the bourgeoisie. The Chinese Communist Party controls the bourgeoisie. But he always conditions it. He says, "Oh well, they mostly control." I have the quotes written here. He says, "Oh, they mostly control the state. They mostly adhere to the party." But we know that this is just not the point being addressed.
If you finished, I want to add some words as well. So, starting with this problem, alright, they say, like, you say China is bad, but China is actually socialist, so it's good. But there were no proofs that China is a Marxist-Leninist state, is a socialist state, and this is the point of the problem. Like, people abroad, they have very vague experience of what is actually socialism. Like, for someone, socialism is when the government does stuff. It became a meme, and it's more socialist the more stuff it does. However, a lot of capitalist states today, even back in 20th century, they actually did a lot of stuff, and they did not become socialist. The Marxist-Leninist theory tells us that the state can be socialist if it fits several criteria, let's say so. One of them is that there is a proletarian dictatorship which suppresses the bourgeoisie. The means of production here are in the property of the society, at least the main means of production. And the working class and his allies are in power. Well, one can say, look, PRC has red flag, they have a communist party in power, aren't they the proletarian dictatorship, aren't they the socialist state? However, if we look closer, then problems appear. Like, alright, they have red flag, but they also have bourgeoisie literally in power, because this bourgeoisie is in the Communist Party. They have capitalists in their ranks, in their government, in their economic heads. And in that case, saying that it's socialist, it's already a bit questionable. Like, yeah, you can see clearly that they try to defend this point. Like, yes, they have capitalists, but these capitalists are actually good capitalists. These capitalists are controlled by the state, by the party, and this sort of things. There is also a thing when they compare the modern Chinese experience with the Soviet back in 1920s. They say, look, China is basically a new NEP. They're going through their new economic policy, and that's why they have capitalists. They have exploitation, inequality, all these things. And
Oh, Vasily, I was going to agree with you and also just state that there are certain publications about the global rich, how many billionaires are brought into existence every year, and they can even get somewhat, boastful about the amount of billionaires that are produced every year within China compared to other countries. They can outpace even the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
So there is a very large class of capitalists, and I think you were sort of describing, you can't just take it at face value that they have a red flag or that they call themselves communists. We have to take into account the class composition of the party itself and what they're actually doing rather than necessarily just what they're saying or how they describe themselves.
Right. They're largely essentializing the Chinese nation and Chinese people as a whole and saying, they say, there's 95 million members in their Communist Party, so how can you disagree with them? How can you disagree with 95 million people? And I think this sounds like some capitalist campaign, like, 95 million people can't be wrong, come shop at our store. But it's ridiculous when you look on the ground in the Chinese countryside and the Chinese social landscape, that bourgeois values are becoming the norm. talked about there's a million millionaires in China, and they love their wealth. I mean, they, if you go on Chinese social media or whatever, you'll see lots of people, very, like you were saying, bragging about their wealth on a personal level, and it all ties into bourgeois values of, oh, if you just work hard and if you follow the law, inside China, you can become a great, capitalist like me, and you can contribute to your great nation. But this wealth at the top comes at a huge cost at the bottom, and that's something that they really try to hide, and they tell a lot of falsehoods in terms of the bottom of society, even within China itself, especially within China itself. They're not being honest about what it's like, for the 900 million working class people, the enormous mass working class people who aren't doing very well in China.
One can tell that all those things about Chinese billionaires, they are spread by Western propaganda, but it's actually an open thing. It's I put the link in the chat from Global Times CN. It's literally Chinese propaganda media, so take a look.
Western propaganda was silly. But it's just, it's facts. I mean, we can't just be ideological and sort of want to accept a conclusion from the get-go without it necessarily being objective,
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing that I really noticed, was that he doesn't want to talk about China. He doesn't spend a lot of time actually talking about China. He wants to talk about the United States, and he wants to talk about crime and the harmful effect of billionaires in the United States, and saying, because we're more intimately familiar with the circumstances of our own billionaires, we can easily say, oh yeah, of course they're horrible and corrupt, and they're all Jeffrey Epstein type people. And they can say, oh, but the Chinese billionaires are different, and this is kind of an orientalizing look, like, because we don't know the inside data from inside China, we can't know. You can't possibly know, how loyal the Chinese billionaires are, But to the point that he wants to talk about the United States, because that's a subject that his audience can, really rally up behind, is the idea that, oh, the U.S. bad, and so that kind of supports this idea that China good, because the U.S. will always be worse, and so it's this relative kind of judgment.
Like how in the U.S. with liberals, they'll only use the word oligarch when referring to foreign capitalists. Like they'll say the Russian oligarchs, but they wouldn't refer to their own domestic capitalists as necessarily oligarchs. Sort of a way to just be like, these national capitalists are good and progressive, whereas though other national capitalists, regardless, if they're imperialists or not, are the bad ones. Just very odd.
I see in the chat someone saying, oh, we're not saying that Chinese billionaires good, U.S. billionaires bad. We're saying, billionaires are a problem, but they're just under control by the Chinese state. And someone in chat is saying this. But the problem with that, oh crap. Sorry, I had a source here. Sorry, I lost my source.
Oh, that's all right. I mean, I guess we can sort of change directions here and pivot. Vasily, do you have anything you want to add?
So, drawing small conclusion to this first thing, I'd say that Midwestern Marx wants to make this thing like that. China is socialist by its definition, claim it's wrong. However, in reality, I think it should be turned that way. China is not socialist, and you should prove if it's socialist. And this is the point where they start to maneuver. It's not actually socialist. yes, they have capitalists, but they still have something socialist. But they cannot define what is the thing that makes modern China socialist. While
Looking in the chat, they're saying to be rich is something that should be, admired, sort of to that we're outdated, our views on socialism, and that it's this new, more advanced form that doesn't sort of fit, the historical texts on socialism. It's just so ridiculous. It's constantly changing.
And what I was going to say, earlier about how they do actually say Chinese billionaires good, U.S. billionaires bad, and they say that by pointing out, Chinese billionaires are building up the country. They're making the country wealthy. They're building things, hospitals and railroads inside China. They're doing so much for China, whereas U.S. billionaires, they just steal, and they only characterize U.S. billionaires negatively. But the Chinese billionaires, they're building Africa, they're building up China. They're so magnanimous and so obedient to the state that they're doing such good things. So it's completely untrue that they don't say that Chinese billionaires are good, because they objectively say that they're doing good things by building up a quote-unquote socialist state.
yes, I agree. The thing is that, they put it like that. There are bad Western capitalist billionaires, and there are good Chinese socialist billionaires. However, well, I guess a lot of monopolies in different countries, you can say about them that they're actually building something, they're developing productive forces, they are good in this or that way. Take even Russia, for example. Didn't they build power stations in Africa, in former Soviet republics, in Arabian countries? And you can take the American companies as well. Aren't they building this or that enterprise in the United States now? Even, Amazon. Yes, Bezos is a bad billionaire, but look, he created a system that stretches for basically all over the world. Isn't he actually developing productive forces? If Lenin said that monopolies are coming to socialism, they are making the foundations for socialism, then isn't Jeff Bezos actually communist?
Yeah, that sort of point, I think we'll talk about it later, but it's the productive forces versus relations of production, and just exclusively focusing on one without taking the other into consideration, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, so, well, again, making small conclusion, there is the bourgeoisie class in China, and the socialist state is supposed to suppress the bourgeoisie, while in case of China, we see that they're kind of prospering. They're in prosperity. And it's already a big thing that questions the whole Chinese socialist stuff. So I think we will go further. And the next thing is about special economic zones in China. Take a look.
And the goal in these reforms and in these special financial zones was not to abolish or wipe out what the base that had been laid by Mao, which is how it's often described and looked at in the West, is just a turn towards capitalism and a move away from socialism, but it was to deepen what Mao had done and modernize China.
So Tom, would you like to debunk this thing?
Well, it's very funny what he says repeatedly, that Mao built up something that Deng could then take to the next level and continue, and I forget the specific words that Eddie says here, but bring these building blocks that Mao created and bring them into fruition, which is, I think, very funny. That's something we always hear about in Marxist-Leninist theory, right? Building up socialism for to create capitalism. The goal of socialist construction is actually capitalism. Isn't that funny?
Well, it's sort of an implicit thing that opening up to Western foreign direct investment, or just, it doesn't have to be Western, it could be anywhere, any other country in the world, that was a necessary step. They were essentially forced to do that due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that they had to open up their economy so that they can build up their productive forces so that they could achieve socialism at some indefinite point in the future.
And it'd be very funny for them to blame the Soviet Union for the rise of capitalism inside China when it was, Deng Xiaoping doing it on his own in 1979, far before the Soviet Union collapsed. This is even before the kind of chaos of the 80s years in the Soviet Union. So China chose to go in the capitalist direction, and to be honest with you, Mao was involved in bringing Deng Xiaoping back into the leadership, and Mao brought Deng into the highest levels of leadership, and he brought them in to the most important decision-making processes in the mid 70s. And people say, Mao was senile, when he was doing this. It's like you credit Mao for all this, socialist construction, and then when he does a bad thing, you say, oh, he's literally a senile old man. Which, if you look at the sources, is an absolute lie.
Well, I think first we should sort of just outline what these special economic zones are, sort of what they allow for, what it implies having them within the country. So obviously these special economic zones contribute tax incentives. You can have lower tax rates for investors if they invest through these special economic zones. And obviously the idea is that they contribute a lot to foreign direct investment, which we see in the 90s in China having huge influx of foreign direct investment, hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into China. And then we're left at the point of having to reconcile all of this influx of capital and saying that this is still a socialist state governed by the dictatorship of the proletariat, which I suppose, since they're saying China is socialist, they accept that it is a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Well, and they also say it's state capitalism, so I guess, they can combine these two things. It's not the leadership of the bourgeoisie. Really, the bourgeoisie are just involved in an alliance with the state.
Comrades, if you finished, I'd like to add some words too.
Well, one problem I do have with this discussion of the special economic zones is that they like to say, they were this temporary and controlled thing. Only bad things can happen within this, safe space. But what really happened was that these were footholds for capital. That's objectively what happened. That foreign capital used these special economic zones to springboard into the rest of China and completely, privatize the Chinese economy. And that is what happened. The laws and the kind of private state relationship that was established in the SEZs, that then becomes applied to the entire countryside. The entire countryside is then made to follow these private property laws and these market laws. When before they were just said, this is just temporary, this is just in this enclosed space. But no, we know that these conciliations are not, temporary conciliations or, necessary.
Vasily, did you have something to say?
Yep. So, if we look at these special economic zones closer, what were they about? So they allowed foreign companies to set up joint ventures. They have contributed about 1/5 of China's GDP. They had reduced income tax, special economic policies such as duty-free export, low-in import tariffs. Being profitable after losses will result in reduced taxes for 5 years, and elimination of corporate tax under losses. So it's basically creating capitalism for foreign companies so that they could develop their free way. And one can say that these things are just like the Soviet concessions they made in 1920s with foreign companies. However, the biggest difference is that the Soviet Union never allowed capitalists to rule import and export. The import and export policies were always under the control of the Soviet state, of the worker state. And actually, there were a lot of talks in the Soviet government, in the Communist Party back in 1920s. There were people who actually wanted to make the Soviet Union back in that period like the modern China. They said, all right, if we see that the socialist revolutions aren't going well in Europe, we have already made several fallbacks. Why don't we go even further? Why don't we allow capitalists to get more? And Nikolai Bukharin was infamous for his words. He said to peasants, comrades, become richer. And he was harshly criticized in the party for saying that, because it looked like he called for capitalist things, for capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union. And there were actually white guards, a lot of people who went into migration. They lived in Europe after they were expelled by Bolsheviks because they hated the Bolsheviks. And they said, hey, look, those people, they are restoring capitalism. Look, it's going to be like Thermidor in the French Revolution. They're gonna turn capitalist soon, and we will get back. But the Soviet Union, they performed well. They finished their NEP very quickly, and they were able to launch a successful socialist reconstruction of the whole society. And if we compare the Soviet Union and modern PRC, even if it's called NEP, like one can say that China is going through their own NEP, we can clearly say that China has failed their own NEP. In the Soviet Union, when there was NEP, Bolsheviks never allowed bourgeoisie in the party, in the government, and actually they allowed bourgeoisie, like small and middle, to be created only in the sphere of light industry, food, agriculture, clothes, these things. While in China, we see that the bourgeoisie is almost everywhere. And those special economic zones, they, like in the Soviet Union, the Soviet government never allowed even foreign capitalists to exploit the Soviet workers. There were trade unions who defended their rights, and they were supported by the government. And what we see here is like, yes, you're free to exploit our workers, just develop productive forces. In my opinion, these things are not the element of socialism. They're not compatible with definition of socialism.
Mm-hmm. They say, it takes 50 years, for their NEP to happen. I think that 53 or 54 years now, this NEP has been going on, while the USSR did it in 7 years. And China even admits it's going to take basically 50 more years of capitalism to get quote-unquote socialism at some time in the future. And it's as vaguely defined by the Chinese state as these, people like Midwestern Marx define it in their own videos. It's completely vague.
Mm-hmm. So, making a small conclusion here, yes, those special economic zones, they they try to modernize socialism with capitalism, and I don't know, it's like modernizing the progress with reaction. You receive reaction in the outcome.
I agree, and really the implications, whether you believe China is a socialist state as opposed to a capitalist state, I mean, the implications are very different in how you sort of view global politics depending on which view you have. I think our view, the more realistic or objective one, can sort of portend that there will be conflicts, obviously, in the future between different capitalist states, which are occurring now. But it's a really less rosy view of the future than as if we were in some new Cold War between the US and China.
All right, and before we go on, I'd like to read messages from those who support us. There was one 10 euro donation from anonymous comrade. Thanks to you. You help to keep our project alive. And there was another thing from a user nicknamed Paleohomoist, who sent 1 euro with the next comment. Hello, comrades Paletstorm. I'm very poor. Do you have any investing advice to help me make my green bigger, but in a communist way? Well, if we apply such logic of those who defend the actual existing socialism, communism is an inevitable future of the humanity. If you want to invest in the better, invest in the communist movement. And you can also ask a question by clicking on the link. I put the link in the chat. And here we go to the next thing we wanted to talk about. This is about, well, it's kind of common. It has like commonplace. It's about development of the productive forces. Let's take a look.
Okay, every economy has markets, and every economy exchanges goods. In Mao's China, it was just that the markets were mostly controlled by the state. The state was like the only substantial buyer and seller, out of necessity, because they were mostly feudal economy before that. They were agrarian. They needed the development of markets at all, some kind of market, and they needed eventually the development of their productive forces. And what they did was they used the agricultural surplus to industrialize and make steel, which was then, could then be used to industrialize and collectivize agriculture.
So here it is. Kevin, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about this point because I think it's common, sort of as a mistake of viewing socialism just that the development of the productive forces up until a certain point is necessary, and that China is using markets as sort of a tool in order to build the productive forces up to a certain degree at which they can sort of sustain socialism. However, I mean, just looking at it from just a one-sided point of view, if the relations of production are still capitalist, I don't think there's ever been an instance in history where a state has just gone from capitalist social relations to socialist social relations just through specifically the growth of the means of production. For example, if a country develops to, however you want to measure it, gets a GDP of X, then they'll have a possibility of achieving socialism. But I mean, if they still have capitalist social relations, they'll never get there. Obviously, the U.S. has been developing that's where I'm from, in a capitalist manner for hundreds of years, and they've developed their productive forces. They've become an imperialist power, and they have never achieved socialism. And unless there's a real qualitative change in the relations of production, I don't think that that's ever in the cards. And I think this perspective just is looking at it either unintentionally or intentionally in just a very one-sided way, where it's just a very straight look at the forces of production. But it's not the only thing that needs to be taken into consideration.
And the problem is that all this development, all this building up of productive forces is just going to create a capitalist state. And it's building up and defending a capitalist state. And you can see how they behave internationally. You can see how they behave internally. It's a capitalist state. And we're going to provide the data as well, just to simply prove this.
Vasily, did you have anything to say?
Yes, I actually have. So look, all these words about, they develop productive forces, every country has markets. Firstly, it's quite easy to say they simply develop productive forces. But if you take things that happen in reality, they are alright. Even if they are developed by capitalism here. They're developed by exploiting workers, because you cannot get income without exploiting the worker. The surplus value thing. It was well described by Karl Marx, and I don't find it necessary to explain all the scheme here right now. You can simply open Das Kapital and read about it. You cannot get all those things without exploiting workers. And it's the point when, under the mask of developing productive forces, we see lives of literally millions of people who get the oppression. They're oppressed, they're workers, usually they're paid very few money, and it's a very difficult topic about the Chinese trade unions, because there are a lot of, you can find those news when workers went on strike and they were met with police, with armed forces. What I want to say is that it's hard to say that developing productive forces with applying capitalist methods, I mean, in the economy, it can hardly be called socialism. I saw a lot of messages in the chat like they're actually suppressing the bourgeoisie, but it's difficult for me to explain, even for myself, that they're suppressing bourgeoisie when I see literally billionaires. If they suppress bourgeoisie, I would say they failed if they have billionaires as bourgeoisie. Yeah, let me finish. In the Soviet Union, they did suppress, and there were no billionaires.
Maybe we can open the topic now of talking about what is the suppression of billionaires like, because these people are really convinced that it's happening in a way that it's not. And the main thing that they talk about is the execution. That's so flashy that the state executes billionaires, and they say that this is proof of the state's control of billionaires. So we can get into that, or we can get back to talking about. I can talk about this execution issue and the application of criminal law to billionaires, or we can talk more about markets in China and things.
Yeah, go on. It's a good topic.
Well, so they love to talk about the execution of billionaires as if it shows that the kind of capital itself is being repressed, and the role of capital is being repressed through these executions. When you get down to it, it's an idealist thing where they say, oh, it's kind of like a propaganda campaign. They even admit this, that it's kind of a propaganda campaign by the state to scare the other bourgeoisie into following the law. But that's the problem, is that when you look at the list of people who've been executed by the state, you don't see people who horribly oppress their workers and this sort of thing, and own massive companies that rob workers of their health and livelihood through capitalist means. That's not who they're criminalizing and repressing. That is the kind of thing we are talking about when we talk about repression of capital. We're talking about repression of the class itself. But so if you look at the numbers, only 14 billionaires have been executed in the past 20 years. You say, oh, that's still a lot, 14 billionaires. Well, look at what they've been executed for. Yuan Baojing in 2006, he murdered a guy. He personally murdered a guy. If you look at another person who was executed more recently, he was a pimp. He was a human trafficker and a drug smuggler. So these people are executed for crimes. They are not executed for trying to influence the state, because influencing the state is a normal part of running the capitalist state. The capitalists are supposed to have a role in organizing what the state does, and China admits this. But the implication of having a few billionaires arrested and jailed and killed is that Xi Jinping, big boss Xi, is killing billionaires to get too greedy and exploit the workers too horribly. But what's immediately obvious is that the billionaires who are executed for more finance-related crimes, these finance crimes are robbing the capitalist class itself. It's crimes that have robbed investors, not crimes like the mass robbery of billions of Chinese workers of their surplus value. That's not what they're being repressed and taxed and jailed for. And if you look at the numbers again, a little over 1% of Chinese billionaires have faced criminal prosecution for any crime whatsoever. So they're taking literally the repression of 1% of this class to represent, 1% of the highest echelon of this, monopoly in capitalist class, to represent the repression of the entire capitalist class. And it's completely idealistic, because they're not actually repressing the role of the capitalist class in Chinese society. They're just repressing 1% of people who do literal crimes within the law. And so the point is that this is a capitalist system of law. So exploitation of the workers is legal. And so they're not going to be executed for that. And that's what we have a problem with. And that's not going to change inside the Chinese state.
I would add as well that, like executing them physically, it's not actually working. You see, those capitalists, they're like Hydra. They can cut one head, but another one grows. And the point is that the way to deal with them is not by killing them, but by destroying those things in the economy that allow them to pop up.
Like labor markets.
Yeah, as well. Let's take the Soviet Union. I can hardly name any capitalist that was executed. All right, they were probably sent to prisons, but when the Soviet Union started its socialist reconstruction, started its 5-year plans. Yeah, by the way, recently I've been reading the big Soviet encyclopedia, and here the new economic policy for them, it was not just the 1920s. The Soviet historians called the new economic policy all the period, starting from 1920 and going to 5-year plans to 1930s. So it actually for them the new economic policy wasn't like about capitalism, but it was just a new economic policy. What happened after the poor communism policies? And getting back to bourgeoisie, they were not executed. After all these things began, they were simply absorbed by the socialist society. Some of them were, let's say, preforged, and others just ended being secretaries, being basically people who were working with papers in this or that enterprise. And this is how the Soviet Union dealt with the bourgeoisie that was created in 1920s. And of course, this bourgeoisie cannot be compared to the Chinese one, with billionaires, with giant enterprises, with imperialist actions.
And who has done this development of industrial society? Who has been built up by this industrialization in China? You look at the numbers, it's 60% private corporations. 90% of corporations doing imperialism in foreign countries. 90% of these are private corporations, and they're operating outside the Chinese state, and they're not going to follow a kind of stricter workers' law when they're operating inside Africa or inside Greece, for that matter. The imperialism is done with an independence from the state, but then when the state's needed, it comes in, guns a-blazing. And we can talk about the state's involvement in military-style imperialism or the military stage of imperialism. We can talk about that in full in a later part.
Yep, that's true as well. So what conclusion can you make to this point?
Well, there's development of forces, but it's for the benefit of a capitalist class and the capitalist state leading it.
And I'd say if this state defends the interests of capitalists, and it does, then it can at least hardly be called socialist. Because if you defend capitalists, you defend the whole essence of capitalism. You defend the exploitation. And I don't know what hypocrisy it is when you say the state is socialist, when it literally does the opposite thing.
Mm-hmm. The role of the workers inside the Communist Party declined. I mean, as we say in our video, which he didn't want people to hear, 74% or something was farmers in the earlier years of China, and now it's less than 10%. It's a minuscule number of working class and producing class participation in government.
That's true as well. All right, now let's go to the next one, and this one is kind of common as well. They say that there it is, that socialism is state capitalism. Let's take a look.
Socialism is state capitalism. Socialism is literally when you take the state away from the capitalists and then you start using the state on behalf of the workers to establish a real political democracy and establish a socialist economy. So because every new economic system bears the birthmarks of the old system, that's a Karl Marx quote, socialism is going to be state capitalism until it can, progress to a higher stage. And China is trying to modernize and develop and keep pace with the U.S. or outpace them, the imperialist U.S. So they need some giant expansive industries, and they need some sort of access to these global markets, these global capitalist markets, where especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, most the material wealth in the world was.
So here it is.
Yeah, socialism is state capitalism. I mean, what would Lenin say? What was the whole point of Lenin's writings on the NEP, where he said, this is not a socialist economy, this is like state capitalist economy? Why did he even make this distinction? If we're going to go back and years later say, it's all the same thing. And this comes from, the poor standpoint that they're coming from. All these questions are kind of tied into one another, all the previous questions. And so from this wrong starting point, he's ended up here. And he's been forced to kind of take on this ridiculous, basically, position that socialism is state capitalism. And this is how we start descending into all the statements of, Gaddafi was socialist, and the United States is socialist. We've been socialist for 80 years. Lots of things are said. Russia is socialist. This group of people and everything, they love to say this. And essentially, it's a social democratic position. And this guy, Eddie, particularly loves social democrats. Whether it's AMLO in Mexico or Putin, basically. If you run, a state that has some kind of social services for workers, then you're good. And if you're not aligned with the U.S., then you're good. And you can be socialist, even.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he really distorts that Marx quote about the birth pangs of, when you are in a socialist society, it'll have some remnants of the from the womb that it emerged from of capitalist society. But obviously Marx didn't mean that they were a similar thing, that state capitalism is socialism. He was really, if you look at the entire quote, when you take it within its proper context, it's, I think, distorted to draw that meaning that he does from it, especially in defense of China as a socialist state. Because you can just say any state you could claim as socialist. You could say U.S. just is, it's socialist, but it retains the birthmarks of its capitalist past, which it's just silly. It's very nonsensical.
Right. And they say that all these state capitalist countries, or rather just capitalist countries, this is socialism. And that just lowers our expectations for what these states should be doing. Even a socialist state suddenly has to act like a capitalist state, has to act imperialistically, and so that's a cover for when you look at the world and you see these states that you love, like Russia or whoever, or any other country acting imperialistically, or acting against solidarity with other countries or with workers. You can say, they have to do this because they're in a alliance with the capitalists, and they have to respond to their national bourgeoisie. They have to represent national interests. It's like, so what's the difference? If you're going to represent quote unquote national interests of a national bourgeoisie, how are you any different than like the American state that defends its national interests and supposedly defends American workers from threats around the world?
Is it all from you?
Yeah, that was all for me. Tom, do you have anything to add?
Well, I want to comment on one more thing he says about this kind of blurred line between state socialism, or sorry, he even got me there. It's state capitalism and socialism. And when he says that, wouldn't it be great if we had communists on the corporate board of Twitter? And then we could set up all these things. And it's like a comical line, because he says, we could set up profit sharing inside Twitter. And this is simply ridiculous, that we would have the capitalists basically still running Twitter, even under his, ideal situation, he's just inserting communists, into the bureaucracy, the capitalist bureaucracy, instead of toppling this bureaucracy. It'd be a simple matter to, completely topple the corporate board of Twitter. You wouldn't have to keep a single one of those board members to run that company properly.
What does the board of directors do? The board of directors meets and they go over their results and they work on maximizing the profits of the capitalist organization of which they run, which means what? Maximizing their revenue subject to their costs. It's a constrained optimization problem. So they're maximizing their profits, and the costs are their labor costs, and obviously in addition to other costs. But it's just so ridiculous keeping that same organization, of just, it's sort of like imagining capitalism onto socialism. That's just like, oh, we're all board members, rather than we all collectively own the means of production. Like Vasily said, no capitalists within the party, dictatorship of the proletariat, and all these things that are well known and that we've talked about at various times throughout our videos and discussions.
And they say that the state controls the corporations, but then he says, oh, look how great it is, there's communist members joining the private boards of these corporations. Well, in order to steer them in the right direction. Well, it's like, well, if the corporations are supposedly controlled by the state, then why do they need communists on the inside, to guide them again, So clearly, the state is not, running them towards a capitalist or towards a communist endpoint. The corporations are expected to operate in a capitalist way, and you're kind of tagging on this, a vague attempt at, state control by inserting "quote unquote" communists inside the board. And that's another matter. Is that what is the caliber of these Communist Party members? They of course believe in the state socialist. I'm sorry, the state capitalist model that he's talking about. They believe in capitalism in China. And if you're the best communist in the Communist Party, you're going to be the most supportive of private interests. So I would not trust a Communist Party member to lead, this corporate board of Twitter inside China or whatever to any good end. And at the end of the day, if you have a corporate board leading the company, then it's going to be, like Kevin said, aimed towards profit making, and that's it. You can't, redirect it in some slight way towards public benefit. So it's a reformist attitude.
Yes, that definitely is. Have you ended?
Sure, let's keep going.
But before we go on, I'd like to add several words as well. So, all right. Marx was living in 19th century, and of course, his task, like number one in priority, was to establish a proper theory for the working class to fight for its rights and conquer the power. So his vision of how the socialism should be established, it's kind of vague. But even if we take the Communist Manifesto, we can see that he created a list, and this list is what already gives us a good definition of what socialism should look like. It includes centralization of credit in the hands of the state, one national bank, centralization of the means of communication and transport, extension of factories, creating a common plan, equal liability of all to work, abolition of all rights of inheritance, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes, and combination of agriculture with manufacturing and industries, and free education for all children in public schools. So if we take those things and apply them to the Soviet Union, we can see that even the Soviet Union, it was Soviet Russia and other republics, they were demolished by the First World War, by the Civil War, and then they only had 20 years to rebuild and to construct socialism before World War II. They were able to introduce all those things in less than 20 or even 15 years, if we take a period from 1925 to 1940. And of course, I'm not even speaking about decades of socialist construction after the Second World War. When we come to the point of monopolies, Lenin was the one who could see the construction of socialism and put his efforts in it. He said that the state monopoly is one step close to socialism. For socialism is a state capitalist monopoly turned for the people and therefore stopped being the capitalist monopoly. We can see that for him and for the Bolshevik Party, creating monopolies and introducing the whole NEP thing, it was not a goal by itself. They were not creating it just to develop productive forces or this or that thing. It was one step for them to go to socialism. And we know from history that they were successful. Yes, they introduced this or that thing, but it was not for a long period of time, for they know that it's not good to play with capitalism, I'd say so. By playing with capitalism, I mean that it's very easy, as our modern experience shows. It's not that difficult to distort all those things, to turn from making monopolies to create socialism to making monopolies just because I want money. You cannot play with capitalism because and here we come again to this question of killing billionaires. You can kill this guy, you can kill that guy, but you cannot simply execute the whole way of things. You cannot execute the economic order. There are other things that are required to do that. The Bolsheviks used them, and they used them successfully. And what we see in China is that they became the thing by themselves. They are not for socialism. They are for making their position more strong, the position of monopolies. And sooner or later they will turn into socialism. It's now for them, I guess it's it became like a holy Bible. Yes, they say words, they read words, but what they actually do is they're doing capitalism.
And Eddie Midwest Marx even admits, that there's serious problems between these monopolies and the small owners, the small private farm owners in China. In that he says that having private farms is good because it makes people less dependent on agricultural corporations. So he literally admits that there is this contradiction between, this one form of ownership and the monopoly form of ownership. And the fact of the matter is that the small, the less powerful side of this fight is losing, and the countryside is immiserated. It's left, in an uneven state of development, while the countries or the cities in the east, face greatest concentration of capital and monopoly power, in the world, and they've built up this impressive state apparatus in the east that doesn't really benefit the people in the countryside, because they want the people in the countryside to come in and be the labor force for these big city factories of the monopoly.
And I would like to add that the whole thing, socialism is state capitalism. Yes, socialism may have such elements in form, it may look like state capitalism, but the essence will be socialism, just because this state capitalist thing, for example, the state capitalist monopoly, was turned for the people's needs. And as Lenin wrote, it's this way that it stops being a state capitalist monopoly. Like, even if we take the Soviet Union, the example of the Soviet Union, yes, there were some things like trusts. They were created in 1920s. They kept being here even in 1930s. But by that time, their thing was not to make profits. For making profit is the main goal of capitalism. Their goal was to make the life of the Soviet people better. Money for them was not a thing. The the practical results were a thing. And here is the big difference between the big capitalist monopoly, corporation, and the socialist state. The capitalist organizes all these things. He makes them very complex. Even like take Amazon, they operate it all over the world. It's giant corporation. There are a lot of giant corporations. All those big corpus, big tech corpus, Apple, Microsoft, Steam, Valve. There are a lot of them. But yes, they're organized. They can provide their employees with this or that useful thing. But the essence of them is making profits. Like all those millions of dollars, they are created because it's the point. They were created to make money, to put those money in work and to make even more money. And the socialist state differs from that in that thing that yes, it can create such things in organizational way, in technical way, but its goal is not to make money, but to make people happy, to defend the interest of the socialist state, of the working people.
And your point there is exactly why Eddie makes so many comparisons between China and America, and he neglects to make basically any comparisons between China and the Soviet Union. Because when he compares it to America, he can say, oh, the accumulation that occurred there was so much more immoral. They oppressed their workers so much more. And even I think in this video, he says, the oppression in the American cities, during industrialization and in English cities is comparable to China today. And so you're admitting it. You're admitting that, this industrialization is coming at the cost of, human livelihood, human quality of life and human health and all these things, and the robbery of the workers. But the comparison to America, comparing America to China, just goes to say that, this is how capitalism's done. We rob the poor. We can't be blamed for how capitalism works. We have to rob our own poor. And somehow the operation of capitalism in the past is somehow an excuse for the operation of the Chinese state, which they say is special and socialist and controlled by this Communist Party. But then they freely admit that the state operates in the exact same horrible ways as a capitalist state did 100 years ago. So how can you be socialist?
And one little thing, it's very funny to see that those people, they were actually the Soviet Union back in 1920s. There was a left deviation, and those people said, like, look, we have a state with the 80% of the popularity of the population being peasants. Peasants are reactionary class. Then why don't we just rob them to create a socialist industry? Because they're the class of the past, and we need workers. Workers are the power. So why don't we just rob the peasants and create more workers? And this was the position of Trotsky. And the whole party struggled very hard against that. The reason's kind of obvious. The Soviet Union was the state of workers and peasants. The peasants were the workers' allies, and if there was an attempt to exploit peasants, it means that their union is destroyed. And that's why the Central Committee, the majority of the party, fought against those views. And it's very interesting to see that those left-wing views, they're tightly connected with the right-wing ones. With those things like, yes, if we need to exploit people for the productive forces, let's do so. So I hope it looks obvious now that such views, they're distortion of Marxism, and they have nothing with Marxism. So let's go on. And here is another argument. Midwestern Marx claims that we misunderstand Lenin on working with capitalists. Let's take a look.
I think people misunderstand Lenin, and I'm going back to this because Pulisterm, the creators we're reacting to right now, say they're Marxist-Leninists. Lenin said we have to work side by side with the capitalists, or he said we're going to have to learn to do that because we have to learn their tricks of the trade and the tactics and the technology that they use for running industry, at least the ones that will remain useful in a socialist or transitional society.
So here it is. Kevin, would you like to debunk this thing?
Yeah, I think we've sort of talked about this, obviously, in our preceding discussions, but it relies a lot about, or it relies on essentially just misquoting Lenin, saying that we have a lot to learn from the capitalists, the so-called tricks of the trade, as he refers to them as. But really, Lenin was saying that quote during a very specific time in the history of the USSR. Specifically, it was during the NEP period. And during that time, as you'll see in our video, talked about the historical period of war communism and the situation that the USSR was in preceding the NEP. And the specific quote that Lenin said about working with capitalists, he said, "Go to business, all of you. You will have capitalists beside you, including foreign capitalists, concessionaries, and leaseholders. They will squeeze profits out of you amounting to hundreds %. They will enrich themselves operating alongside you. Let them. Meanwhile, you will learn from them the business of running the economy, and only when you do that will you be able to build up a communist republic." So I think that it's really just a distortion in the sense that it's just saying we have a lot to learn from the capitalists, not necessarily just in a specific time in the history of a socialist state. Obviously, when the USSR was in the NEP period, but it isn't generally a good thing to say about learn from the capitalists, because what the capitalists do is exploit workers. That's really where they derive the surplus value, their profits. So obviously it's a bit disingenuous to say that we have a misunderstanding of Lenin, that we have to work side by side with them. What does that mean in actuality, in practice, working side by side with the capitalists, other than just specifically learning how, to administer production within the context of a planned economy? But he's really just talking about learning practical things about production from the capitalists, not really working side by side with them, as he says, because that's really more of a class conciliation type of thing to say.
And the thing is that the exchange, and this is the cornerstone of Lenin's quote, the exchange in Russia was completely destroyed by that moment. This quote was taken from the work, let me see its name. Yeah, so it was named The New Economic Policy and the Tasks of the Political Education Departments. A report to the Second All-Russia Congress of Political Education Departments, October 17, 1921. So it was 101 years ago, almost. And to get the environment of that period, might go back in history. So there was World War One, and there was the Civil War. And by 1921, the exchange thing in Russia, it was, well, I can hardly find any words to describe how bad it was. It was destroyed. It was annihilated. It was obliterated. I don't think it's a secret, but I live in a region that's called a part of Central Russia. There are several traditionally agricultural regions. In Russia it's called Central Russia, but if you look at the geographical map, it's kind of Western Russia. Now it's where Prokhorovka, well-known village of Prokhorovka, is situated. It's Oryol, Kursk, Belgorod regions. Those regions where the agriculture was in favor always. And I had a time when I went to the regional archives to find some things about Oryol during NEP period. And there was a case when there was a hunger in 1921, and the state ordered to get some industrial goods manufactured in Moscow and Oryol, to put them on train, to move that train in Oryol to get some industrial goods here, and then to move that train to Volga region, because it was where the food was produced. There was hunger in Oryol region, and they wanted to exchange industrial goods for bread in Volga region and get that train back to Oryol to basically give the food to the citizens and the population in general. And even if you take this situation, the government made a special train to get to one region and then to another to do one simple thing: exchange, trading. And I hope it shows how awful the situation with trading, with exchange, was at that period. And the most horrible thing that they actually got these industrial goods on the train. They moved the train to Volga only to get them back because there was no food. There was a great famine in the Volga region in that period. And this is why Lenin points on the importance of that thing, of the exchange. He says, yes, we don't know how to do it right now because it was the Soviet Republic. It was only 4 years old, and it was still in the state of civil war. And all those things, they were to be established. And that's why he says, you should not be afraid to work with capitalists, to learn from them how to work. And if you learn, if you apply those methods, but you transform them you will adapt them to the conditions of the socialist state, they will stop being capitalist. They will become socialist. And by using those methods, you will make our socialist republic better place to live. And that's how it was done. But now we see that those words, they are taken out of context, and they're used to basically justify the exploitation of millions and the expansion of the Chinese capital.
Mm-hmm. And to speak to the failure of this quote-unquote Chinese NEP, that they have to do in 50 or 100 years what Stalin and Lenin did in 20 years, but in the 1920s and 30s, so it's completely ridiculous to say, look at how well they're doing now when it's taken them more than twice as long, and the economic result of this development from their quote-unquote NEP has been to increase inequality. The poor have gotten poorer in China. Back in 1978, the bottom 50% of people controlled around 27% of the income, or they had a 27% of the income share, and that has completely collapsed to today, where it's now around 15%. And it's the level of poverty has stayed the same, or the level of income inequality for the poor has stayed the same from 2005 to today. It's basically the same. And it has not gotten any better as they claim for the poor.
And well, concluding this working with capitalist thing, some statistics from our video on NEP. I will send the link later. We have a whole video on the new economic policy of the Soviet Union. Take a look. So the results of Lenin's advice to learn how to work from capitalists was that by the end of what we today say the new economic policy was that the state of share of state cooperative sector increased from 44% to 76%, and the share of the capitalist sector decreased from 41% to 90%. And well, just compare those things to the modern China, where they have, let me see. Yes, and now in China they have corporate ownership growing, getting almost 40% from 10% in 1998, and public sector dropping from being 75% in 1998 to 55% in 2015. Again, even if we can say there is a new NEP in China, then it's a failed NEP. It's not how you should make this transition.
Mm-hmm. And what he says is that he characterizes the NEP for China as Lenin saying, we have to learn the tricks of the trade of the capitalists. And essentially what he's trying to get at is what was discussed by Lenin and Stalin, that we have to learn from the capitalists. But this is just a disguise for what's actually happening. The aspects of the capitalists that China is actually adopting are the property form of the capitalist and the monopoly role of the capitalist countries, instead of increasing the role of the state, which you pointed out, Vasily, has been completely slashed. The state-owned enterprises have completely collapsed in the role of the economy, and private ones take its place. And the same with literal public ownership, which was once 100% of the corporate ownership was by public, Chinese government ownership, 100% in 1978, down to, as you said, around 55% today. This is a downward development. This is not a development upwards towards more public ownership. It is towards private ownership.
Yep, that's it. So I think we're done with this argument, and we will go on. And before we go on, I'd like to ask our subscribers to hit the like button, to share, and of course to subscribe, as we have some videos coming in the next weeks. And you can always support our project by clicking on the link below. I sent it in the chat. Alright, now let's go on. And here we have, well, we kinda talked about that topic before, but it requires paying special attention as well. And it's about China's anti-poverty and anti-corruption campaigns. Let's take a look.
They knew that the market reforms and opening up the private capital in these special zones would lead to an increase in corruption. Deng Xiaoping and all of his theoretical allies within the party knew this would happen before they did the market reforms. And there were some rough times in China, and the markets definitely, and the bourgeoisie definitely did try and take control of the party. But there have been so many efforts within China to combat this. And, as I said, the Communist Party has 95 million members who are dedicated to building socialism. They're not just going to let the bourgeoisie take over. And the anti-corruption efforts that have recently been carried out by Xi Jinping have combated corruption quite well, really well, actually. I mean, it's rooted so much corruption out of the party. And at the same time, they've enacted their anti-poverty programs.
Well, here it is. Tom, would you like to talk about that?
Well, the most basic fact that we need to address when we talk about how poverty has been alleviated, or so-called by increasing wages, that's the principal way that they say that they've eliminated poverty. It's just by this simple, dollar amount increase in value that they're paid in wages. Then this is completely discounting inflation, the lower real wages that they're actually being paid. So as their wage in dollars increases, they can actually buy the same amount. And this is evident when you compare the rate of the increase of wages in China to the rate of the increase of the price of rice. They are increasing at roughly the same rate. So for every step forward that the workers, quote unquote, get, they're actually just keeping up with the cost of labor production, which is what Marx calls. So the Chinese government, they have to spend a little extra money, or the Chinese capitalists have to spend a little extra money to feed the workers the same amount. And at the end of the day, the money that the workers pay for food goes back to the capitalists. So they're at the same position they were 20 years ago, essentially. And this is borne out by the data. If you look at the income inequality comparison, the small amount of income that the lower 50% of society gets, I mean, this is 50% of all Chinese people, only make 15% of the income. And that has stayed flat, essentially. And so you say, prices have, wages have gone up, but prices have skyrocketed even today. And so this is the data that's really representative, goes back to 2020. And we don't even know what's happening today with inflation of food prices. We've seen some outrageous inflation in food prices in major Chinese cities in the past 2 years. So this problem of the wages not being able to buy the same amount of food, it is only going to be getting worse in the coming years, and has been getting worse in modern times. But they say, poverty's been alleviated simply because it's paid more than, let's say, extreme poverty. So they create this, moving goalposts, as it's colloquially called. They say they can eliminate poverty, but then they actually say, it's actually extreme poverty. And the boundary for this is just $355 a year. That if you make more than that, then you're not in extreme poverty. But malnourishment and unemployment are skyrocketing. And he says, there's 95 million Chinese Communist Party members. Okay, well, there's 200 million Chinese unemployed people. There's 150 million malnourished Chinese people. So if there was a malnourishment party, they would be a bigger party than your Communist Party, your so-called Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And nine... Go on. Sorry, please go on.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, the U.S. is an extremely unequal state, and I don't want to harp on talking about the U.S. just because I'm from there. But by a lot of measures, China also has extremely bad inequality, just like we do. And I think our position is essentially that the Chinese workers are being exploited to a very high degree, and they're not getting paid the value that they're necessarily producing. Because I have some extremely talented, intelligent workers. But I just don't understand how we can square the circle of saying that there are, the Chinese state is the vanguard of the working class, while our lying eyes show us differently. I mean, I really don't understand how this is such a controversial opinion in Marxist circles.
And I would like to add a bit. They say a lot about Chinese Communist Party having millions of members, but the Communist Party of the Soviet Union also had millions in their ranks, but these ranks they hardly could do anything back in 1989, 1990, or 1991 when the Soviet Union was destroyed, because the party was corrupted. It was basically destroyed, and even Stalin back in 1920s he pointed on that problem. He said if our party if it says too much about its achievements but doesn't pay much attention to its modern state, it won't be able to perform well, and if it won't be able to perform well, then it will get destroyed. And by the way, he actually predicted what's happening right now. He said if we fail, if the Soviet Republic is destroyed, then the world will be filled with the blackest reaction. And yes, he was absolutely right. You can see we live 30 years after the Soviet Union was destroyed, and it's literally the blackest reaction the world has ever seen. So getting back to those millions of members, yes, back in 1991, millions of people in the Soviet state, in the Communist Party, they simply stopped being communist, socialist. They simply started being just people living in the bourgeois state, and they had nothing wrong with it. I actually asked some people, even party functionaries, I told them, you lived in that period when your country it was destroyed. Why didn't you do anything to prevent this from happening? And they said, well, we were just an average people. We received an order from the higher ranks, to stop doing all the stuff, and we stopped. And that was the thing. And this is how they can do the same thing in China as well. A lot of people, those millions, will say, well, we simply got an order to quit the Communist Party, and we did. This is basically how they will respond to justify this or that thing. And another thing is that if we look at the modern Russian government, actually there are a lot of people who were Putin was a member of the Communist Party. Medvedev, he was a member of the Young Communist League, Komsomol in Russian. A lot of people were members either of the Communist Party or of the Young Communist League. And I can hardly say if the current situation in China is better, because the capitalists here, they don't call themselves communists. They don't say they do it to develop productive forces. They just say, we're capitalists, we hate communists, we hate socialism, we're building our national country, building our national state. And in China they say, oh, we're actually good capitalists, we're actually building people's Gucci stores. And yes, the same thing could happen in the Soviet Union, and we could have all those bureaucrats like Putin, Medvedev, all those other Russian officials saying, yes, we're communists. So again, it's quite hard to tell if capitalists staying under red flag are better than capitalists who openly say they are reactionaries.
Mm-hmm. And they say, oh, China's not a neoliberal state. They don't have a neoliberal economy. But you can only say these things without looking at the situation. And if you compare China in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and the development of inequality in China, it's clear that, or at least there's clear evidence, we can post in the chat, from the WID, the Wealth and Income Database. It's clear that the rate of development of inequality in China was exactly the same as it was in the neoliberal, quote-unquote neoliberal, real neoliberal countries. And so what's the point of having this different state and having supposedly non-neoliberalism when they're doing neoliberalism and having the causes, or rather the effects of neoliberalism at just the same rate? on the ground, the situation between the capitalists in China and the capitalists the rest of the world are very similar, except China is in a position to really grow, and the other capitalist countries are in market situations where they're decaying.
Mm-hmm. And well, there is still another thing I'd like to add. There were people writing in the chat about Engels, that he was actually more progressive than most communists after him. Well, yes, those people who call themselves communists today, as we can see, most of them don't even know the Marxist theory. They call themselves communists just because they like red stuff, red flags, hammer and sickle, China, these kind of things. And the bourgeoisie is different compared to the 19th century. Like back in 19th and even early 20th century, they hated socialism, they hated socialists, communists. They didn't want to have anything in common with them. They suppressed the Paris Commune, the socialist, social democratic parties all over the world. But now the times are different, and they see that they can actually take the red flag stuff. They can use it for their own profits. They say, yes, we're the good ones, and here are the bad ones, so support us, and the bad ones will be destroyed. Multipolar world order, all those things that are used to distract workers. Yes, that's I would say that it's one of the characteristics of our period, that like Lenin did not see that, even Stalin. I'm not even saying about Marx or Engels. Yes, the bourgeoisie is using communist phrases, communist symbols, and we will have to deal with them.
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about communists and the role of China in the world communists, someone was commenting in the original Midwestern Marx video about how, people complain that China doesn't support revolutionary workers around the world, and in fact they do the opposite. He says, but China does participate in communist internationals. I'm a member of the Communist Party of Britain, and they work with us. It's like, okay, so they're working with, revisionist parties. They work with, for example, this CPUSA or CPB or even, Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And that's somehow proof that this is a communist project. Well, but these parties are what we're fighting against in our own domestic situation. I'm sure, most people would be disappointed with the leadership of the CPUSA in America, and so the fact that it has a pro-China position, that China supports CPUSA, that doesn't say good things about the participation of China in the communist movement.
Yep, I agree. So let's go on. And there is another one. We have also discussed it earlier. It's about can modern socialist society have billionaires?
Ramped up their anti-poverty programs, really. I just want to say an early socialist society can have billionaires in the modern era. An early stage socialist society, obviously under communism, trying to abolish money and stuff. But right now, China is modernizing. In China, money doesn't equal power the same way it does in the U.S. Because the people and the party and the country's plans for modernization and development come before the billionaires, right? So billionaires in China symbolize wealth and an increase in modernization and overall strength for their country. Billionaires in the U.S. are oligarchs. Billionaires in the U.S. don't have their companies controlled by their party and regulated by the party. The billionaires control the state and use it to suppress the workers. The billionaires are oligarchs who can use their money to control the party. And, there are exaggerated Western articles that try and make China out to look crazy, when it comes to like executing billionaires and stuff. But especially during the anti-corruption efforts of Xi Jinping, there have been billionaires executed in China. If you're caught being corrupt and working against the people and working against socialism and working against the security of China, even if you're a billionaire, even if you have all that money, they'll kill you. And that right there is the main difference between China's billionaires and the U.S. billionaires.
So, here it is.
Yeah, he brought up what we'd already talked about, which is this idea that executing billionaires equals state control of the bourgeoisie, which we've already talked about, is completely ridiculous. And you can see how he characterizes it there. He's trying to make it seem like this is about controlling the capitalist class and their, kind of financial and industrial participation in Chinese society. That's not what these executions are about at all. Like we already said, these are people convicted of murder. These are convicted a large number of people who go to jail are just for outright bribery, and say, oh, this is just what he's doing is just good billionaire, bad billionaire over again. And so, the Chinese billionaires are so good. Well, look at the real estate market in China and see all the good work that the billionaires who own the real estate industry in China see what they've done with their independence and their freedom from the capitalist from the so-called socialist state. The capitalist state in China has given them absolute freedom to destroy the real estate market. And now it's going to cause possibly serious problems inside China and across the world. And if you look at the 1% of billionaires who have been jailed, many of them are from the real estate industry, and so you can see that there's so much corruption going on, and yet the state isn't clamping down on it. And it's been allowed to run wild, and we see that they just have to demolish, entire cities of empty buildings because of this capitalist overproduction. The capitalists, decide what gets made, and Xi Jinping says himself that it's the capitalists and the market that are leading the direction of society. Here he says, and we have a quote. He says that China will continue to let the market play a decisive role in resource allocation. And it's this myth of the invisible hand of the market again, as if the market is not the manifestation of the will of the capitalists and the industrial position of the capitalists. So clearly there's not a planned economy if the market and billionaires are deciding which way the industrialization of society will go. And Xi Jinping says this explicitly. He says we must not return to the old path of a planned economy, which makes me very curious why people like Eddie do say that there's a planned economy in China when Xi Jinping himself says that there is not. And so Eddie clearly understands that it would be good to have a planned economy. But the Communist Party of China seems to disagree with Eddie and says that the anarchy of the market is what should be leading Chinese development. And the consequences for the anarchy of the market are being borne out right now with the collapse of the real estate industry and chaos in the living situation of Chinese people. You say, it's getting so much better, but unemployment is at 200 million, malnourishment is at 150 million, and this is not going to change.
Well, I think just to sort of take it back a step, I think if you're making the point that a modern socialist society can have billionaires, if you just think about it, how does one become a billionaire? If you just work every day, your wage income will give you enough to survive, maybe have some savings, but you're not going to become a billionaire just, working every day, selling your labor. So envisioning a modern socialist society that has billionaires, I think that you would also have to say that a modern socialist society would have to have capitalists as well, because really the only way that you can become a billionaire is by owning a business, owning shares, inheriting massive amounts of wealth through lineage. So it's very contradictory, in my opinion.
And again, this thing undermines the whole concept of socialism. If socialism is about eliminating the main contradiction of our period, of the capitalist formation, and I mean the contradiction between the labor and capital, but yet they have capitalists in the Communist Party, they have capitalists as the part of their system, then it's definitely not a socialism. And it's not just, emotional conclusion, but people for almost 2 centuries have been writing about that. And we have experience of real socialist countries. They did not have capitalists as the part of the socialist system. And it's this thing that made them actually socialist. There was no exploitation, there was no oppression, because there were no capitalists. And here in China they are.
And they claim that they're waging a class war against the billionaires and the capitalist class in general, but that's completely not true. And that's borne out by the data. Only 1% face any, 1 to 2% face of this capitalist class faces any kind of legal consequences for the crimes that they do. And that's not representational, and that is not the suppression of an entire class. And in reality, you have the bourgeoisie, these billionaire individuals leading state operations. They are in key roles in the apparatus of the state, because this is a capitalist state, and so that's why there are billionaires there.
Yep, I agree. So I think that's enough for this argument, and we have 3 of them next, and the next one is about Chinese finance capital.
Because Lenin talks about finance capital so much, and he explains it so concisely in a way that I think is pretty simple. But China's banks are largely, and this is something they're criticized by Western media all the time, they're largely controlled by the state, controlled by the central authority. And Western academics in their analyses of China have even said that the privately owned banks and the investments of the private banks, the not state-owned banks, are still public-private hybrids, and they blur the line between public and private property because there's so much regulation and control by the central authorities of even the private banks. But even ignoring that, over 40% of the banks at least are directly controlled by the state. The smaller banks may not be, but they answer to the big 4, big 5 giant state-owned banks, which are the Bank of China, the Chinese Construction Bank, the Industrial Bank, the Commercial Bank. The Industrial and Commercial Bank are basically one, but they do serve 2 functions. And then the agricultural banks of China. So you have industrial, construction, agricultural. So that's 4 of the largest banks in the entire world, not just in China, but in the entire world. And they cover all sectors of production in Chinese society: agriculture, industry, commerce. And they're all controlled by the state. They are all, those are what are in control of planning production, the production of 1.3 billion Chinese people.
So here it is.
I'll talk a little bit about this question, particularly with emphasis on the state banks. If you search for any of the big 4, Chinese Bank, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, China Construction Bank, Agricultural Bank of China, and simply the Bank of China, you'll see that they're profit maximizing banks. They all post their annual profits. They have investor relations pages if you just Google them. So I think the error here is stating that they're state-owned and implying that they're socialist, because reading through, quote, It's stated that they blur the line between public and private property. So, with respect to the state, how much influence they can exert over the planning process when the banks are profit maximizing, there's definitely limits to the planning that the state can have because of the the anarchy of production and commodity production and exchange. So I think nationalization of the banks is necessary within a socialist society, but it in and of itself is not sufficient in lieu of all the other necessary conditions, dictatorship of the proletariat, all these things that we've written about. We have articles on our website if any of you are really interested in that topic. But I think that this argument in and of itself just suffers from conflating. These banks are state-owned. The state is the Communist Party of China. Therefore, they blur the line between public and private property, but in the essential way in which they differ from Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, other large banks, it's really a distinction without really much of a difference. I mean, even in the United States, there's one state-owned bank, I believe the Bank of North Dakota, and you'd be out of your mind to argue that it's socialist because it's state-owned, with the major difference being that, the names of the country, it doesn't have Communist Party in its name. But I think that it's not a very strong argument if you look at what the bank's actually doing. They're profiting. They're driven by profits, just like any other bank. So that would be my input on this discussion.
Mm-hmm. And these banks are the engines of world finance capital. Like Eddie likes to complain about the World Bank and the IMF and all this, so how bad their loans are. But China is an integral part of this international finance system. And these banks are the ones doing this stuff that he complains about. And then he said, oh, it's state-controlled banks. So then you're saying that the state is responsible for all this, damage that's caused by these IMF and World Bank loans that the Ministry of Finance in China is contributing to. We have a quote here by the Vice Minister of Finance in China. He says, "We stand ready to continue strengthening cooperation with the World Bank in relevant areas." So they are involved in American and British and European and Russian world imperialist enterprises in terms of finance capital and in terms of industrial capital. And that's what they're famous for, is the industrial capital part. But people like Eddie like to neglect the role they play in the world finance capital.
Vasily, do you have anything you would like to say on the topic?
Well, no, I guess.
All right, fair enough.
Mm-hmm. So let's go on. But before I play the next fragment, so we're already going for more than 2 hours. That's a good amount of time. Also, I see we're back to 40 viewers. Hello, comrades. Don't forget to press like buttons, share, and subscribe if you have not done it yet. So, comrades, I want to suggest this thing. The next argument we wanted to debunk is about improving the standards of life, bringing people out of poverty and social credit system. But the fragment that we decided to cut from the stream, it's 6 minutes long. And as we're already going for more than 2 hours, I want to suggest you not to play that, but simply debunk that and go to the last one.
Mm-hmm. And this is a question that, I believe part of the quote that we were going to play was talking about the social credit system and how we apparently lie about the social credit system. It's not that bad, it's not that big of a thing. Well, we didn't say that it was this, thing that the Western media portrays it as. And Midwestern Marx likes to mischaracterize us a bit and say that we agree with American talking points. And this is one of them, the social credit score system. Even talking about it at all is submitting to the West.
So, what would you like to say about this bringing millions out of poverty thing?
Yeah, I think
Well,
I can.
maybe.
Oh, sorry, Tom.
No, go ahead.
Well, all I was going to say is he is using a similar argument to what the World Bank is using to advocate the progressive nature of capitalism, lifting X amount of people out of extreme poverty, which they defined as incomes less than $1.90 every day. Really, the main difference is just that how they're attributing it. Whereas the World Bank would say that this is a miracle of the free market and how it's making the world a better place. For those who believe that China is socialist, they're saying that their ability to lift people out of poverty is evidence that they are socialist, or at least that they're relatively progressive compared to other countries. Here's a quote from the Vice Minister of Finance of China. China achieved its goal of poverty reduction in the new era as scheduled at the end of 2020. We accomplished the arduous task of eliminating extreme poverty and will make significant contributions to global poverty reduction. Going forward, China will continue to sustain and expand its gains in poverty alleviation and comprehensively realize rural revitalization. So, this quote was taken within the context of a World Bank statement, which you can Google it if you're at all interested, but it's basically saying that since China has lifted so many people out of poverty, it's it's a great thing, but it's really, like we were saying, the threshold is extremely low that they're using of just $1.90 per day. We're not really making the argument that living standards can't increase under capitalism and that the proletarianization of a country can't rise the relative living standards of people. I think that's absurd. I just think that our perspective on the subject was somewhat distorted.
And to comparison to this definition of poverty at a dollar and some, the price for rice in China during this period from 2005 to 2020 today, the price of rice has gone up from around 70 yuan to above 150 yuan. So the price of rice has doubled in this amount of time, where they're talking about raising so many people and giving them so much more access to wages. The price of rice literally doubles. At least medium grain rice, and then small and early grain rice are at 145, 140 yuan. Still a significant increase over only a 10-year period, basically doubling the price of food.
I also think that the topic of this problem is what was called the impoverishment of the proletariat. Am I spelling it right, comrades?
Yes.
Yes, so it's the tendency. Most of the people understand that as the thing that, the proletarians, they are poor and that's all. And this is where capitalists come and say, hey, look, they are not so poor in 20th and 21st centuries. They have something to lose, not just their chains. They have houses, they have all those things. But this tendency, it's not about the proletarians just being poor. They're about the working people not being able to come out of this poverty because they are kept in the poverty by the whole way of things. Marx explained this in his Capital by these words. Imagine you have a small house. It can grow, like you can make several additions to it. It can even grow twice, triple times, and you have a palace in the neighborhood, and it also grows several times. So it doesn't depend on how you expand it. It's your house is always going to be smaller than this palace. And I think this explanation is the perfect example. And we can apply this to China as well. Like they can lower statistics. They can say, "Hey, look, they get one or two things better, and they are not poor anymore." But it will not change the actual poverty. It will not actually drive them out of that poverty.
And they credit the buildup of wealth in concentrations among a minority, and they say, "Oh, look, there's so much development happening in China." Well, who is being developed? It's this tiny minority and the place where they live, and it's not equal across the entire country.
And also, the thing that is most contrast for me is that, again, if we take the Soviet Union, they were actually able to overcome poverty, even not relying on the help of Western capitalists. I mean that they were not a part of the capitalist system. Yes, they could buy some things from capitalists. Back in 5-year plans, they even bought some factories. The capitalists came in the Soviet Union. They were paid to build buildings, and they retreated back. It was not like a financial connection. It was like, we will pay money, you will build it for us, and you will live. We will use it. No any special economic zones or something. This is how the Soviet Union defeated poverty. And they actually did really well in defeating poverty in a country where like the majority were uneducated peasants who stayed in poverty for literally centuries. And even in those hard environment situation, and the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, Stalin, they were able to overcome those problems. It's a good example of how the poverty should be dealt with in reality, not by changing statistics and proclaiming victory over poverty.
Agreed.
And if you have nothing to add, we come to the last argument, and it's about military expansion and debt entrapment. Let's take a look.
Aims. But then when China helps Tajikistan with their security issues, we're like, oh, China's evil. They're not socialist because they sent their military over here. Like, the U.S. sent their military over there and armed a bunch of extremist terrorists. But when China does something to combat that, all of a sudden they're not real socialists. And then it talks about China setting up on the valuable mineral deposits in Africa. Yes, countries need developmental loans to create the machinery and the economic outlays needed to extract and process and utilize their own resources. Countries who have been prevented from doing this by the actual imperialists and by the Western finance capitalists. So why does Venezuela, a socialist country, have fuel and oil shortages when they have the largest reserves of oil in the entire world? It's because they don't have the machinery or the technological capability right now to refine their own oil. One of their main problems is they don't have enough refined oil to run the machines that are needed to refine more oil. Because of the U.S. sanctions, because of the U.S. enforced blockade, because of the ice.
Oh, yeah, it ended here, so it was about US sanctions.
he talks about developmental loans and how these loans are only to let these countries utilize their own resources. But who is actually utilizing the resources? It's not the Congo. It's not the people of the Congo. They're not building cell phone factories inside that country. No, it's the mines are owned by Chinese companies. The minerals inside the mines are the property of Chinese companies, and the people of the Congo just dig them out of the ground on behalf of these Chinese capitalists. And this is the same pattern of the flow of raw materials that has been identified over and over again in Marxist theory. That these big finance-dominating countries need raw materials for their industrial production, and so they set up these relationships with client states that have a weak state and will essentially agree to be exploited by the more powerful state. And that is exactly what's happening in the Congo. That's why the Chinese state is one of the biggest funders of imperialism in Africa. And they say, oh, China's not imperialist in Africa. They're giving so much. Well, China is the biggest donator of troops, peacekeeping experts, so-called mercenaries through the UN peacekeeping services. It's China who dominates those forces now. And these UN forces, they're just there to serve the capitalists. And so they have Chinese-built tanks and Russian-built tanks patrolling around Chinese-owned mines inside a foreign country, inside the Congo. And they drive around and they shoot whoever, tries to illegally, tap some oil or tries to illegally take some cobalt, and they kill them, and they fund, reactionary regimes that also will make sure to agree to this extraction process. And so when years ago, when it was France and the UK and the United States who were funding these UN police forces, we could all recognize that this was an imperialist project, and we knew exactly why those UN policemen were stationed outside those mines, because they represented foreign interests. The UN is a representation of capitalists' international, kind of agreed interests, and China is taking, advantage of this UN apparatus, just like they participate in imperialism in other established ways. But that is a form of or a manifestation of their imperialist interests and their military pursuit of their interests. And further, Eddie says that, China is an enemy of the Islamists. What a joke! What an absolute, and it's kind of disgusting to say that China was fighting Islamist forces in such and such country in Tajikistan, that the U.S. is responsible for them, when Deng Xiaoping himself helped form the reactionary core of the Mujahideen by sending Uyghurs from Xinjiang. He sent them to Pakistan to be trained in these same reactionary fighting camps and training camps that created the Taliban, the most reactionary forces in the world. China was always involved in this process. You can say, that's a lie. They're telling a lie. Well, what does China say about it themselves? The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs released through their university, through the China Foreign Affairs University, which is the official university of this Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. They released one of their students released a thesis work on this Chinese policy that led them to support the Mujahideen. And I can quote it here. It says, as a part of China's policy of uniting with the United States to counterbalance the Soviet Union, China sent large quantities of AK-47s, anti-aircraft missiles, and rocket launchers to the Mujahideen during the war through Pakistan and the U.S. CIA, worth an estimated $2 billion to $4 billion in military aid to some of the most reactionary forces. And they were not sending them to, the better forces within the Mujahideen, the ones that represented kind of national liberation. These were the Islamists. And to go back to this alliance with, terror, this kind of reactionary trend, is to point out what happened in Libya. And just like with every other American imperial project, China has gone along with the plan. And in Libya, people like Eddie like to say, "Oh, China was such an ally to Gaddafi," and they opposed this NATO-funded scheme to have Islamists take over the country and overthrow that state, create chaos in that country. China was completely for it. And in fact, Chinese companies and lobbyists were pushing for things like the Iraq War and pushing for things like the Libyan intervention, because it's Chinese companies which had the most to gain. And I have another quote here that talks about that when the NATO bombs started to fall and the Islamists, the Islamist faction in Libya started to run all the oil fields, suddenly China didn't participate in the embargo. When NATO and the U.S. were embargoing Libya and preventing, Libyan oil from getting out and getting any money to the Gaddafi's forces, the Chinese pulled their oil companies out of Libya. Oh, but as soon as the NATO forces are in control, suddenly the Chinese companies return. And we see that Sinopec, during the toughest months of the war, this article says, the main Chinese oil company, Sinopec, pumped millions and millions of dollars into one side of the civil war. They chose a partisan stance with the NATO reactionaries in this civil war. So even worse than the kind of neutral position they had during the Iraq War. And the aftermath of both wars is the same in that Chinese companies, particularly Chinese oil companies, swooped in on Iraq, swooped in on Libya, and now they reap the gains of a cheaper oil price that they have to pay. And in both cases, they supported the reactionary side of this struggle. They either, send millions of dollars to the American proxy government in Iraq, or they send millions of dollars to the proxy Islamist government in Libya. So this is a completely imperialist outlook on foreign affairs. This goes back to, the very basis of the Chinese state. And it's, while we can identify that, 90% of the companies that are doing foreign imperialism are private and thus, kind of independent of the state, which they would say, oh no, these private companies, they're doing imperialism with the full control of the state behind it. Mm-hmm. And that's not totally wrong, because this imperialist attitude, goes all the way back to Mao and Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, invaded Vietnam in order to reassert, Chinese national interests, and Mao Zedong himself worked with Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford to unite against the Soviet Union. And if you say, like I said earlier, if you say that, oh, Mao was senile during this time, you can look at the transcripts yourself. He says that, essentially, he's talking about complex issues of African politics and talking about how he's funding the most reactionary groups in revolutionary Africa, in Angola. He's funding. He's talking to the U.S. president about funding Jonas Savimbi, this horrible war criminal. And this is the character of Chinese international policy in every continent. That they support reactionary forces in a kind of national pursuit of interest, and they side with the United States in supporting the reactionaries in the history of the 21st century. Working with the Islamists in Libya, working with Jonas Savimbi in Angola in the 80s. This is a long-term commitment to an imperialist foreign policy. I said a lot, but essentially, what Eddie supports is a kind of social democracy, and he supports Russia or Mexico's AMLO or Russia's Putin. But if they ever come into competition with China, apparently, China is going to completely take the side of the imperialists. If there's any conflict with Russia or or Mexico's AMLO, or any social democracy in South America. It seems that from the participation in American imperial projects for so long, it would be ridiculous to think that China would sacrifice itself and open itself up to destruction by opposing the United States in whatever war. They'll either be neutral or they'll completely support it, and in large part their neutrality does support the American project in the end.
Well, I agree. And the only thing I can add is that I find it hilarious for people abroad, especially in the West, say like, oh, hey, you're saying that China is doing imperialism, but it's actually not. It's bringing prosperity. Well, if you take a closer look, you can barely see any difference between Chinese bringing prosperity and simple, average imperialist expansion.
And the bar gets lowered so much that they start out by saying, oh, China has no obligation to support communists around the world. That would open them up to being a victim of America if they helped communists openly. Well, now it's to the point where, okay, they don't support communists and they don't even support anti-imperialism. So how much further can you go? And I think we see the end result of this slide in the fact that these people support one side in this Russia-Ukraine conflict. They take an arbitrary position, supporting one power as being the good power, just like to support Chinese billionaires as being the good billionaires. And this is only going to get them to support, the most horrible conflicts and the wrong sides of them, and taking these, capitalist positions in some of the most important, issues of modern times.
And sort of beating their chests as if it's the only, self-evident position that one could take, and putting down any sort of dissent and criticizing.
Mm-hmm. And people like Eddie, they really love Putin or they love Evo Morales in Bolivia. When these regimes, they just exist to be, more advanced extraction regimes, pumping out raw resources, like lithium for Chile or Bolivia, and sending it to Chinese factories. And so, he's applauding, just this next advancement of kind of capitalist exploitation system, as if it's, just because it's slightly better than the old, kind of Congo-style chaos. But we can see that China supports both. They support kind of a peaceful extraction and a chaotic extraction. They're fine with either, depending on the circumstances. They completely, have a hostile attitude towards anything good happening in the Congo. But then, that you can say, oh, but they have such progressive views in Bolivia. They're helping Cuba, they're helping Bolivia, but really they're just helping the capitalist class and creating this international network that they use for horrible ends.
Well, we're streaming for almost 2 hours and a half, and yet people are still joining in. Good evening to you, comrades in Europe. We keep our stream about China. Don't forget to hit the like button, share, and subscribe. Yeah, sorry for interrupting, Tom.
I think I've adequately given enough examples, but these people aren't satisfied with even basic kind of presentations of imperialism China has done. You have to keep listing them and listing them, and there's always a condition, that says, they didn't have to support, like with Sri Lanka, like, you can't support the Tamil Liberation Front, because of this and this reason. Well, it's not about supporting them. It's about the fact that China destroyed them. That's the issue we have is China's completely negative participation in the world and funding this horrible regime in Sri Lanka that's now being objected to by the Sri Lankan people, in such a public way. And it's the same in Zimbabwe, where China effected a coup d'état of Robert Mugabe. Say, oh, that's a lie. It was a coup d'état by China, even though the organizer of the coup d'état, was in China 24 hours before he presented the President Mugabe with the terms of the coup d'état. He literally got off the plane, and within 48 hours, there was a coup d'état happening, and he was meeting with international Chinese military advisors or military ministers, and it was Chinese equipment that had not been registered in the country before this coup d'état. Chinese tanks, Type 89 tanks, were used that had never been registered in that country. So they brought in this new Chinese-made equipment. They had military officers trained in Nanjing Military School. That has been and these officers have been working with the Chinese capitalists for so long, even under Mugabe. And so it's clear that they just wanted to be able to work directly with, the head of the state, and the Chinese capitalists didn't want to deal with, the strong state that Mugabe kind of ruled over, and so they just get rid of him and they replace him with a objectively worse state that is pushing privatization, is pushing the suppression of the workers.
Well, I have nothing more to add.
Likewise.
Got it. So, as you can see, it took us 2 hours and a half to debunk a small piece of those arguments against our video and claiming that China is socialist, defending different cases showing that cases of capitalism in China, and I would like to make a conclusion. So one can say that there are billionaires, they expand, they exploit workers, but what's the purpose of defending China? And in my opinion, well, during all the 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the communist and workers' movement in general, in the whole world, they are in very difficult situation. Communists are disorganized, workers as well. There are several countries where we have good communist parties, however, they are not the majority in the communist movement. We have a lot of things to be done, and working on unified theoretical platform is one of those tasks that we're working on them, but actually they should have been done decades before the current day. And in my opinion, let's separate. There are people who support China because they are paid by China. Sometimes these are members of the revisionist parties, like mentioned above, the Communist Party of Britain. Sometimes it's the Chinese themselves, and the Chinese government is well known for, they have representation in their parliament, and the Chinese government pays them to say good things about PRC. And there are people who, they don't want to admit that the communists are in a very difficult situation now. They are afraid of that situation, and they want to think that it's not that bad. There are people with red flags, they do good stuff, they probably good stuff, they cannot do otherwise. And that's how they fall into support of literally imperialist actions. And, yeah, go on, Tom.
And to talk about bad actors, and Eddie is very free to say that, Pollitsturm is CIA, Pollitsturm's a bad actor. But he, in this video on China, he defends, Caleb Maupin. He says that, who just had a revelation of his, horrible abuses in his group. And if you go to the video, the original video, you can see the top comment is from Caleb Maupin's group, congratulating Eddie for making this video and saying that it needed to be done. But talk about a bad actor with Caleb Maupin. This is a guy who gets paid by the Chinese state and the Russian state, as just part of his regular work, but he has ties to this LaRouche organization and these COINTELPRO guys like Ramsey Clark and the LaRoucheites. And the LaRoucheites worked for the CIA back, during the 70s, and they admitted to doing so. So this is a guy who is Caleb Maupin and this group of people that Eddie likes to defend are completely bad actors who can't be trusted, and they're aligning with most horrible anti-communists, and they're aligning with state governments of whatever capitalist state. And so of course they're it's going to be in bad faith, because no matter what they say, it has to be acceptable to their network of pro-Russia, pro-China people. They're never going to speak the truth because they're not incentivized. And they're not paid to speak about the problems of China. They're paid to speak about all the good things about China. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that these guys are wrapped up in these networks that have been around since COINTELPRO days. And the fact that they're issuing out such a heinous, male chauvinist and national chauvinist line, and they're very proud of their chauvinism. And I don't think that this discrediting of the communist movement is accidental to their relationships with all these bad actors, all these literal bad actors that they love to defend and associate with.
I would like also to add that a lot of people who call themselves communists, they think that we're in bad situation just because the capital is strong. They think that there will be a revolution someday and then communists will get stronger. However, let's take the October Revolution, for example. This work, all those first months of the Soviet power, then the whole decades of the Soviet Union, they were prepared by this long, grey, I would say even boring, everyday work of the Bolshevik Party in the underground during early 1910s, first decades of the 20th century. And these were the periods of the hard theoretical struggle when Lenin fiercely defended the principles of Marxism. He did not tolerate any deviation, left wings or right wings. He stood for scientific approach, for Marxist approach, and that's why his works became a great legacy. They became a part of Marxism, and that's why we now refer to Marxism as Marxism-Leninism, because we admit that Lenin did so good in defending Marx's legacy that he improved Marxism, that he made Marxism up to date. And this is the work that we as communists need to carry today as well. We cannot sit and wait till this or that thing happen. It's up to us to make all the things better. And of course we will do it, because the future is on our side basically. We know how the society acts, how the history goes. We have dialectical materialism and historical materialism in our arsenal. So sooner or later we will win. But this date should be as soon as possible. Every day of capitalism means hundreds of thousands of lives being lost. A lot of global problems, hunger, inequality, especially inequality, when there are a lot of money. Several people own more money than the half of our planet. And this money, it was not created from air. It was created by the labor of millions of people. And of course, it's up to the communists to make these people the owners of the products they produce. And it can be only possible if the communists in all the countries are organized in the good communist parties. We have to create those parties. And this is why our theoretical struggle, it will go on. Even in the question of China. Oh, that's it from me.
They want China to swoop in and save them, but it's not going to happen.
Yes, as Chinese capitalists, they're kind of satisfied with the current situation. They only want to make more profits. Alright, if you comrades have nothing to say more, then today's stream is over. Big thanks to our viewers who decided to join us on that Sunday evening. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.